Okay, in this video I want to talk about Nietzsche's influences, and in particular Nietzsche's influence on one philosophical and cultural movement, and it's the one that we're swimming in, namely postmodernism. And I would say Nietzsche is the father of postmodernism, or the first real postmodern. Okay, what does postmodernism mean? Postmodernism is awfully correctly, in my opinion, equated with relativism and subjectivism and perspectivalism, and we've seen that's right up Nietzsche's alley. That is Nietzsche's philosophy in a sense, perspectivalism. There is no truth. But postmodernism literally means, obviously, postmodernism, after modernism, or a critique of modernism. Well, what's modernism? Well, modernism is the philosophy that puts reason at the tippy top, or as the foundation. So you think of Descartes as the father of modern philosophy, the father of reason, of using reason methodologically. He wrote the Discourse on Method. Modern philosophy is rationalism, rationalistic philosophy. Postmodernism, therefore, is a critique of reason, is post-reason, or we could say post-truth, a critique of truth. And of course, what we've been talking about is Nietzsche's critique of truth, Nietzsche's critique of reason. Okay, so Nietzsche is a postmodern. But interestingly, postmodernism takes on sort of a life of its own after Nietzsche. Postmodernism isn't simply Nietzscheanism. Why? Well, postmodernism takes Nietzsche's critique of truth and his perspectivalism, and yet adds something else that Nietzsche would hate, namely what Nietzsche would call slave morality's ethic of concern for victims, or Christianity's ethic of concern for victims. And it kind of combines these two. And you see this now in our culture. Our culture very much is postmodernism, or postmodernist. Now, it doesn't go as far as Nietzsche often on the critique of reason all the way to science, but Nietzsche thinks it's going there anyway. But it combines a critique of reason, or a critique of what Lyotard calls a critique of meta-narratives, and then combines, strangely, the ethic of concern for victims, which itself is a meta-narrative, which I think is a bit hypocritical. Anyway, remember when Nietzsche critiques truth, or critiques good and evil, he says, he wrote a book, Beyond Good and Evil. The best example of this is in Harry Potter, the first one, in the movie, where it's in the book too, I didn't read the books, where Voldemort is on the back of that guy's head, squirrel or something like this. Anyway, he says, there is no good or evil, Harry, only power, and those who are too weak to seek it, or something, right? So if there's no good or evil, there's only power. And what's left when you critique rationality and truth and good and evil? Power. And that's what postmodernism agrees on. Postmodernism says, yes, power is the primary lens through which we can understand the world, okay? Postmodernism is, and its politics and its discourse and its ethics agrees with that. Power is the primary lens and the primary interpretive key through which to understand the world. So the world is not really best described in terms of individuals, but rather groups of power. Now, how does this work? Well, okay, if power is primary, if power is the best way to explain the world, well, then again, Nietzsche's philosophy is there. Obviously there are groups of people with power and groups of people without power. So that comes from understanding the world in terms of power. You understand the world in terms of power, there's going to be people with power and people without power. Now, something that public intellectual Jordan Peterson recently said about postmodernism, I think, is right. That is, and it's because it's right out of Nietzsche, and he's read Nietzsche, as I understand it, that if power is the primary lens to which you understand the world, then group identity is paramount. And postmodernists have no problem with this. That is, people are understood primarily in terms of their group identity. That is, their race, their gender, their sex, their religion, their economic class. So Marxism, in a certain sense, is a form of postmodernism, although Marx was a kind of a contemporary with Nietzsche, but a little bit before. Because Marx says, of course, the way to understand the world is the history of the world. He begins the Communist Manifesto. History of the world is the history of class conflict. Again, groups conflicting over power. There's the haves and the have-nots, or the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The history of the world is explained in terms of economic class. So class, race, gender, etc. This is the primary way, and I'm not critiquing this here. I'm just saying this is the case, that it follows from Nietzsche's, or a Nietzscheanism that would see the world primarily in terms of power relations. Now, the strange thing is that if power is the key to interpreting the world, then group identity becomes paramount, and then you add in the idea that we need to always side with the oppressed, with the weak, with the victims, that for Nietzsche would probably seem like an arbitrary decision, or rather one that we just are habituated in because of our catechesis in Christianity and Judaism, right? I mean, Christianity is the ethic of the weak, or moralizing and creating values from the perspective of weakness. Why should we care about the weak, Nietzsche would ask. Nevertheless, postmodernism takes its fuel from Nietzsche, but in a certain sense can't go as far as he wants to go. It goes in terms of power. It sees the world in terms of power. Group identity becomes paramount, but then it ends up siding with the weak. And this is what's known as, and pejoratively, I think it's often used pejoratively, but not always, identity politics. Identity politics is the idea that power is the primary way to understand the world, and therefore group identity and groups with marginalized groups without power need to be given more preference. Okay, but that seems to me, according to Nietzsche, like a Christian import into Nietzsche's, well-constructed, flawless metaphysic. Okay, and so, and also too, I think Nietzsche would call it hypocritical to a certain extent, because if we're really postmodern, that is post-reason, that is post-meta-narrative or post-absolute or universal truth, why is this ethic of concern for victims or preference for the marginalized, why does that matter so much? Why should we have preference for the marginalized? Isn't that just a perspective? You see, so I'm not sure postmodernism can be consistent enough. If you see the world in terms of power, and all things are just power, why import the ethic or the axiomatic acceptance of the ethic of concern for victims? I think this would be Nietzsche's contribution to postmodernism, but also Nietzsche's critique of postmodernism.